Just one smile can kill a child? That haunting image unfolds when Jenny Wanda Barkman, a 20-something young woman with an almost schoolgirl innocence, stands frozen as she orders children to strip naked in sub-zero conditions. The cruelty of the female SS guards at the Stutthof camp was not mere violence, but a perverse performance of power, where compassion was seen as weakness. In this video, we will take you through the final moments before those 11 women vanished into the night. Uncover how they disguised themselves, hid from capture, and were ultimately dragged back into the light of justice. Every step of their flight, every testimony, and every public trial paints a heartbreakingly brutal portrait. If you want to explore the full, blood-soaked story without missing any shadow of justice, click subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to keep watching. Part 1. The Cruel Smile. The faces of these women always bore a smile as they sent children to their deaths. Imagine a young woman in her early 20s. Hair the color of sunshine. A face as fresh as a schoolgirl's. Yet it was she, Jenny Wanda Barkman, who orchestrated the psychological torture of children. The opening scene shows Barkman taking a delighted drag of her cigarette while ordering an 11-year-old boy to strip naked in temperatures of 10 degrees Celsius. The smile on her lips was not that of girlish amusement, but the knowing grin of someone fully aware of the power she wielded. Jenny Wanda Barkman was far from an isolated monster. She embodied an organized system of violence. In her eyes lay a ruthless confidence, as if the children were nothing but lifeless dolls for her entertainment. Each time Barkman issued a command, the children trembled and obeyed without question. Her fragile appearance, smooth voice, and cold stare made her cruelty all the more horrific. Forcing children to stand naked in the freezing winter was not merely a show of force, but a deliberate act of terror inflicted on their young souls. Stutthof, the concentration camp perched on the shores of the Gulf of Gdańsk, was notable for its unusually high proportion of female SS guards. Many of them were barely in their early 20s, even younger than the victims they tormented. These young women were recruited through patriotic propaganda and taught to embrace National Socialist pride. Then trained ruthlessly. Severity was duty, compassion, weakness. Some mastered their new discipline, with zeal wielding leather whips, wooden clubs, and taunting insults. While the male SS wore their glossy black uniforms, it was these ice-eyed women who turned Stutthof into a living hell. On the morning of January 25th, 1945, Barkman stood her final guard shift as the camp descended into chaos. The artillery of the Red Army thundered from the east, relentless and rhythmic like hammers of fate. Not only did the men break ranks, but 11 female SS guards also hastily prepared to flee. They discarded their insignia, tore up identification papers, wrapped scarves around their hair to disguise themselves, and carried stolen loaves of bread as if they were innocent refugees. In that moment, the line between perpetrator and civilian vanished, shadows slipping through the night, melting into the winter darkness with faces devoid of remorse. Part 2. Chaos and the Stutthof Escape. On the morning of January 25th, 1945, Stutthof was engulfed in chaos. Camp records and administrative files were consigned to roaring bonfires. While the infirmary was hastily evacuated, SS guards and prisoners alike were swept up in the so-called death marches, herded onto muddy roads under the looming threat of advancing artillery. The thunder of Russian guns echoed from the east, like relentless hammers of judgment, driving the guilty to flee for their lives. Amid that frantic scramble for survival, 11 female SS guards made a desperate decision. They shed their uniforms entirely, swapped into civilian coats, and melted into the throngs of terrified refugees pouring out of the camp. Under cover of darkness, they were loaded into lorries, bound westward. Some wove themselves into columns of mothers, clutching their children's hands, while others slipped away to distant villages, shorn of their hairstyles and reborn under assumed identities. They believed that a clever disguise would conceal the horrors they had inflicted, that no one would ever associate the innocuous features of a young woman in a headscarf with memories of brutality. Yet such cunning proved futile. Survivors' eyes burned by famine and bodies scarred by beatings etched every detail of those faces and voices into their memories. A single counterfeit smile, they would later testify, was more lethal than a squad's volley of gunfire. By then, Stutthof had long outgrown its anonymity, its derelict barracks, littered with desiccated corpses, and its long, blood-stained corridors stood as living monuments to unspeakable cruelty. Forgotten diaries, left in haste, chronicled the systematic dehumanization that preceded mass execution. No one who had watched hundreds of emaciated prisoners collapse and die from exposure could ever dismiss it as mere collateral. Testimonies flowed from those who had staggered back from death marches, each story adding urgency to the hunt for the fugitives. Polish authorities and Allied investigators seized on these eyewitness accounts, realizing that to bring justice, they would first have to chase down these 11 women who had vanished into the winter night. Thus began a frantic manhunt that would stretch across villages and cities, marshalling local informants, railroad workers, and former prisoners alike. Every scrap of evidence, a torn sleeve, a familiar accent, a survivor's silent tear became a crucial clue. Stutthof was no longer just a name on a map. It was a wound in the collective memory of a nation. And as the Soviet forces pressed closer, the relentless search for those who had once wielded power inhumanely grew into a moral imperative. These women must be found, identified, and held accountable for turning a place of confinement into a landscape of terror. Part 3. The manhunt and arrest of female SS guards. When the female SS guards disappeared, the Allied authorities, and especially the Polish security forces, had no intention of allowing them to slip away unchallenged. The first capture occurred only a few weeks later. In February 1945, a woman had taken refuge under the guise of a nurse, tending to wounded soldiers in a makeshift field hospital. She moved among the injured with practiced efficiency, her striped prison uniform hidden beneath a white smock. Yet a former inmate, recovering nearby, recognized the distinctive scar that ran along her neck. With trembling urgency, the survivor notified the local police, and within hours, the news of her arrest spread like wildfire through the surrounding villages. By March 1945, the noose tightened further. Jenny Wanda Barkman, the notorious guard whose cruel smile had haunted so many, was apprehended at a railway station ticket booth when she attempted to purchase a loaf of bread. The Polish railroad official manning the counter froze at the sight of her. He remembered that cold, unblinking gaze from the day he witnessed an elderly man beaten to death without mercy. That fleeting recognition was enough. Barkman was taken into custody on the spot. her stolen civilian coat discarded as evidence of her attempted flight. Almost simultaneously, Ewa Paredes, another of the 11 fugitives, was caught hiding in a pigsty on the outskirts of a small hamlet, disguised as a humble housemaid. She had hoped to blend in among local families, but an acquaintance who had once served alongside her recognized the way she carried herself. Rumor even circulated that she was preparing to announce her engagement to a Polish soldier, a grim irony given her past deeds. Within days, Paredes's every attempt at normalcy unraveled. Her testimony in winged SS boots, clipped to fit civilian feet, confirmed her identity beyond doubt. In the space of mere months, the Polish security apparatus had tracked down 5 of the original 11 guards. As spring gave way to summer 1945, a further 6 were located through a combination of informant tips, chance sightings, and relentless detective work. None of the women offered resistance when arrested. Some greeted their captors with indifferent smiles. Others uttered only the infamous phrase, "I was just following orders." Yet the war had ended, and with it, any notion that blind obedience could excuse the horrors they had committed. Across Poland, people who had endured years of oppression and brutality now watched the swift administration of justice as a catharsis for their suffering. Public sentiment in liberated Poland was unyielding. Villagers who had hidden from SS patrols during the darkest days now lined the streets to witness the parade of former oppressors in handcuffs. Posters bearing the faces of the captured female guards appeared in town squares, alongside placards demanding accountability for every child forced naked in the snow. No sympathies were extended to those who once wielded whips and rifles. Instead, a collective cry for retribution rose like thunder. The arrests of Barkman, Paredes, and their compatriots marked the beginning of a broader reckoning, one that would see these women stand trial, not merely as individuals, but as embodiments of an ideology that had inflicted unimaginable suffering on a nation. Part 4. Imprisonment and First Interrogation. The female prisoners were brought to the detention center in Gdańsk, a grim building whose damp, crumbling walls were so thin that the cough of a neighbor could be heard down the corridor. None of the women knew exactly what awaited them, but all sensed the aura of death and deprivation that hung in the air. Jenny Wanda Barkman sat dazed on a narrow iron cot, her gaze fixed on a splintered fingernail. In her coat pocket lay a nearly empty vial of perfume and a crumpled letter addressed to no one. On the morning of June 14th, 1945, at 8 o'clock precisely, her first interrogation began. The bare room contained only a small wooden table, 2 straight-backed chairs, and an interpreter to bridge the language gap. The Polish investigator entered in plain clothes, unarmed, and proceeded without ceremony to display 2 photographs, one of a 12-year-old girl, the other of a gaunt boy whose eyes appeared far too old for his youthful face. Barkman did not utter a word. Her silence carried the crushing weight of her crimes. Unlike a routine police questioning, each former SS guard displayed a distinct reaction under scrutiny. Elizabeth Becker claimed she had performed only clerical duties, never once laying hands on a whip or baton. Yet it was the ring on her finger engraved with a pair of initials that betrayed her. A survivor of the camp recalled the exact design and could not be mistaken in quick succession. Other ex-prisoners recounted the horrors forced upon them, marching barefoot across icy metal stairs, enduring blows without provocation. and hearing the sadistic laughter of the very women sworn to guard them, witness after witness stepped forward, their testimonies painting a tapestry of brutality. One former inmate described how a female guard would drag him by the hair to witness his brother's body, then strike his head when tears fell down his cheeks. Another spoke of being forced to carry heavy crates in sub-zero temperatures, collapsing from exhaustion only to be whipped awake. The interrogators listened meticulously, noting every broken rib and fresh tear, every pang of fear that still trembled in a witness's voice. In the hours that followed, the interrogation spread to various cells, with small groups of guards questioned in turn. Some maintained a facade of innocence, parroting the mantra that they had no choice but to obey orders. Others, when confronted with precise accounts, huddled together in silent fear, exchanging glances that spoke of desperation. A few broke down entirely, shoulders trembling, as they realized that the war had ended and their perceived immunity had vanished. By day's end, the interrogation room's air was thick with the stench of sweat and anguish. The Polish officials had not only gathered statements, they had amassed a formidable body of evidence. The detainees left one by one, escorted back to their cells, faces pale and eyes hollow. The damp stone walls seemed to close in on them, as if the building itself bore witness to the crimes committed, and now to the beginning of justice. With each recollection recorded and every photograph cross-checked, it became clear that the trial to come would not be a mere formality. These women, once instruments of terror, would now stand in the harsh light of accountability, facing the voices of their victims and the unwavering determination of a nation bent on retribution. Part 5. Exposing the systematic humiliation. Victims' testimonies painted an unflinching portrait of cruelty. They spoke of numerous rib fractures, of old wounds that never healed, and of bodies wasted by starvation and freezing temperatures. A Polish doctor who examined the survivors documented severe malnutrition, brittle bones, and panic-stricken reactions at the mere sound of approaching SS footsteps. One former prisoner recalled how a female guard forced him to carry his brother's corpse down a snow-covered path, then slapped his face when tears welled in his eyes, sneering, "You should be proud that your brother did not escape." As interviews continued, investigators began to perceive a pattern far beyond isolated outbursts of violence. Instead, a meticulously organized system of daily humiliation had been woven into camp life. Guards employed contemptuous glances to strip away dignity before a single word was spoken. Clothing inspections became rituals of degradation. Prisoners stood naked in the cold, while SS women conducted slow, deliberate searches. Food distribution was manipulated, with purposeful delays that left men and women trembling from hunger. Behind every act lay an intent, not merely to guard, but to destroy hope. The calculated cruelty revealed that these female SS members had not been reluctant instruments of orders, but professional perpetrators who mastered the mechanics of terror. Meanwhile, Polish authorities and Allied investigators raced to compile the mountain of evidence. Documentation included photographs, medical reports, and painstakingly transcribed witness statements. Each piece of proof strengthened the case and narrowed the path to justice. In parallel with the evidence gathering, plans were drafted in Warsaw for a high-profile public trial to take place in Gdańsk. The capital's leadership envisioned more than a judicial proceeding. They saw an international declaration of Poland's resilience and resolve after years of brutal occupation. Preparations for the trial were comprehensive. The courtroom was to be stripped of any pretense of concealment, no curtains, no backdrops, only microphones to amplify every word, rostered witnesses numbered in the hundreds, former inmates prepared to recount their suffering, medical officers ready to testify on documented injuries, and clergy members who had ministered to prisoners amid the horror, even some SS officers seeking leniency to agreed to appear and provide testimony against their former comrades. Posters bearing the faces of the accused were displayed in town squares, each visage a stark reminder of the atrocities committed under the guise of authority. As spring turned to early summer, the stage was set. Streets echoed with hushed conversations about restitution and retribution. In warehouses and vacant schools across the city, volunteers sorted evidence, laid out files, and translated records into multiple languages for international observers. For Poland, this trial would stand as a testament to its commitment to the rule of law and to the victims whose voices demanded to be heard. It would show the world that, though the oppressors had vanished into the cold night, their crimes would not be buried. They would face their accusers in the full glare of public scrutiny, and Poland would emerge stronger for having sought justice without compromise. Part 6. Planning the public trial. When the female SS guards were confined to solitary cells, the atmosphere inside the prison shifted dramatically. Walls that once rang with the clatter of boots and clinking of chains now reverberated with harrowing sounds of psychological breakdown. Some of the women quietly began coordinating their stories, whispering behind closed doors in a desperate attempt to form a protective network of identical statements. Others could not withstand the weight of their own memories. In the dead of night, muffled screams echoed down the corridors as a former guard shouted the names of victims as if they still lurked around her. A few resorted to self-harm, digging rusty hair clips into their own thighs until blood ran freely. The prison guards, caught between duty and compassion, hesitated at each cell door. They knew that forcing an intervention would not erase the trauma etched into the women's minds. At the same time, in Warsaw, Polish authorities finalized plans for a large, public courtroom spectacle. They intended to mark the restoration of justice with an event that could not be hidden or dismissed as propaganda. One official is said to have declared, "This is not a Russian show trial, but a demonstration of Polish strength." Over 300 witnesses had already signed on, from former inmates and camp doctors to priests who had risked their lives to offer solace, and even a handful of SS soldiers who sought to atone by testifying. Newspapers seized on the story, branding the female perpetrators with chilling monikers such as Stutthof leopards and devils in skirts, stoking a blend of outrage and morbid fascination among a public eager for accountability. Parallel to these preparations, investigative journalists operated covertly inside the prison grounds. They managed to snap blurred photographs of key figures: Jenny Wanda Barkman, Elizabeth Becker, Ewa Paredes, images that soon splashed across headlines with the chilling caption, "Smiles while they kill." Readers recoiled at the realization that such calculated cruelty could be carried out by women with gentle features. Within the prison walls, the only counterpoint to mounting horror was the faint murmur of Latin prayers. A few detainees, clutching small rosary beads, chanted under their breath, as though clinging to the last thread of a conscience long thought lost. Their whispers wove through the darkness, a stark reminder that even in the depths of complicity, some spark of humanity still flickered. Every detail of the trial's framework, from seating arrangements in the vast Gdańsk courtroom to the scheduling of each witness, was meticulously planned. The stage was set for a moment of reckoning that would be broadcast not only to Poland, but to the world. As evidence was catalogued and photographs circulated, the machinery of justice moved inexorably forward. The stage was prepared. Soon, the doors would open, and a nation would witness its oppressors brought into the harshest light of all. Part 7. Preparing the Courtroom. On March 15th, 1946, the formal indictments were handed to the defendants. The courtroom had been stripped of any theatrical ornamentation. No curtains draped the walls. No music prelude played. Only a series of microphones strategically placed so that every whispered testimony could reach even the furthest bench. The previous night, carpenters from Gdańsk had labored into the early hours, installing extra rows of benches, wiring the audio system, and numbering each individual seat for the incoming audience. Their task was not merely carpentry, but the creation of a vast hall in which domestic citizens and foreign observers alike would bear witness to justice laid bare. On the morning of April 25th, 1946, the courthouse gates swung open precisely at 8:50 a.m. A silent sea of humanity flowed through the entrance, mothers clutching faded photographs of sons lost to the camp's cruelty, veterans whose weather-beaten faces bore scars both physical and emotional, and survivors whose hollow eyes spoke of nightmares unending. No applause broke the hush. No cheers heralded the occasion. Instead, the crowd stood motionless, a congregation awaiting the solemn voice that would pronounce the balance between crime and accountability. At the appointed hour, 3 judges entered in sober procession, their black robes whispering against polished floors. A single Soviet observer followed, his expression inscrutable. Behind them filed 8 male defendants in muted uniforms, and then 11 women, each guided to the front row. The female accused wore plain civilian attire without adornment. No lipstick brightened their lips. No jewelry glinted at their wrists, and crucially, no handcuffs bound their wrists, leaving their hands visible for all to see. Only one of the 11 broke the stillness, her sobs echoing like a distant storm. While the others remained as unmoving as marble idols, tension filled the air as if it were molten iron radiating from the wooden benches to the high vaulted ceiling. Then the prosecutor stepped forward, opened a thick folder, and began to recite the indictment. His voice carried through the hall, reading sentence after sentence of dry narrative, enumerating victims, listing dates, and naming each defendant's role. At first, the words sounded clinical, almost routine, but beneath their measured delivery lay the raw, searing pain of countless lives torn apart. When the prosecutor's voice cracked on a single syllable, a collective shiver passed through those assembled. In that instant, every person in the room understood that this was no performance for public spectacle. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to the darkest alleys of human conscience, demanding that guilt be confronted and that justice, however late, be served. Part 8. First shocking testimonies. The first witness called was a 67-year-old woman, supported by 2 attendants as she made her way to the stand. She would not look up, her eyes fixed on the floor, and in a halting voice, she recounted the moment Jenny Wanda Barkman smiled as her own child was led away to die. The witness did not accuse Barkman of firing a shot, but of choosing silent complicity over compassion. For 7 minutes she spoke, and in that brief span the courtroom grew deathly still. Hundreds of hearts constricting at the weight of her words. Before the atmosphere could settle, the second witness, Elizabeth Becker, rose to her feet. Barely 2 sentences into her account, Becker's knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor. Unconscious, medics rushed in, lifting her limp form as the judge called for a brief recess. The sight of a former guard overcome by emotion underscored the trial's profound human stakes. The next testimony shifted focus to Mala Zeitbaum, a Jewish resistance fighter who had once escaped the horrors of Auschwitz, only to be recaptured and executed at Stutthof. Her former cellmate appeared before the court, gaunt and haunted. Each line on her face etched by years of trauma. She described how female SS guards taunted Mala as the young woman summoned all her remaining strength to evade death. One guard reportedly sneered, "A fly always returns to the honey," jeering at Mala's futile hope for freedom. That cruel phrase echoed in the courtroom, a stark reminder of how twisting language could deepen the sting of violence. Beyond oral accounts, the prosecution presented a trove of material evidence. Dozens of covert photographs smuggled out by prisoners. Yellowed diaries left behind in abandoned barracks. And meticulously documented medical reports of wounds. Each photograph captured the blank eyes of guards as they oversaw roll calls, or the twisted smirks exchanged during forced marches. The camp diaries, penned in trembling script, chronicled daily humiliations, prisoners forced to stand in freezing rain, stripped of dignity under the watchful glare of female overseers. Medical experts took the stand to testify about injuries too numerous to ignore. They described shattered ribs from unprovoked beatings, deep bruises forming in patterns consistent with whip marks, and chronic malnutrition that left survivors skeletal shadows of their former selves. One report cited by the prosecution detailed a patient with multiple healed fractures, evidence not of accidental falls, but of sustained, deliberate assault. Every piece of evidence rammed against the wall of denial that the accused guards had tried to erect. The photographs drilled holes through their facades of innocence, while the diaries and medical records formed a dam of proof that threatened to burst even in the silent tension that followed each presentation. The courtroom felt electrified by the gravity of what was revealed. By the end of the day, it was clear that the trial was not merely an exercise in historical accounting. It was a solemn reckoning with the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of those who survived. The witnesses had exposed a system of terror that was neither random nor isolated, but carefully orchestrated, and in doing so, they had set the stage for justice to reclaim a measure of dignity for the countless lives shattered behind the barbed wire of Stutthof. Part 9. Barkman's examination and public outcry. The trial entered its second day. Yet the fervor outside only intensified. Banners proclaiming justice for Stutthof and punish the murderers fluttered from lampposts and building facades across Gdańsk. Crowds gathered in the cold morning air, chanting indignantly as they pressed against makeshift barricades. At times, stones were hurled at the courthouse windows, shattering glass and drawing police intervention to maintain a fragile order. Yet inside the courtroom, the solemn legal process continued with unwavering formality. By the fourth week of proceedings, attention turned to Jenny Wanda Barkman, who for the first time since her indictment was summoned for direct examination. Calmly, She took the stand and faced questions without the slightest tremor in her voice. When asked about her role in the camp's atrocities, Barkman stated plainly, "I did not order anyone to strike anyone. I only assisted." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, yet carried an unsettling casualness. The presiding judge leaned forward and pressed. "Assisted in what?" "Precisely?" Barkman met the judge's gaze but offered no further reply. That silence, pregnant with implication, weighed more heavily on the assembled courtroom than any accusatory declaration could have. Many of the other defendants sought refuge behind similar defenses, attributing their actions to the chain of command. They insisted they had only followed orders from superiors in the SS hierarchy. However, the prosecution meticulously dismantled this argument. Witness after witness recounted how these women, far from reluctant pawns, often exceeded any direct orders. They took cruel pleasure in their authority, delaying food distributions by design, administering beatings without provocation, and orchestrating humiliations that fulfilled no tactical military purpose. The state's attorneys argued that such behavior transcended mere obedience. It stemmed from a calculated desire to wield suffering as a weapon of terror. Outside, the citizens of Gdańsk watched intently as justice unfolded inside their grand courtroom. Newspaper headlines excoriated the idea of blind compliance, pointing instead to the conscious choices these women made under the guise of duty. Editorials reminded readers that conscience cannot be conscripted. Placards and graffiti reinforced the sentiment that true responsibility lies in the acts we commit and the cruelties we authorize in ourselves. Inside the court's chamber, the atmosphere crackled with gravity. The clicking of cameras, the rustling of evidence binders, and the measured footsteps of bailiffs echoed against marble floors. Each silence after a question, each pause before an answer, became part of the trial's narrative, a mirror held up to humanity's darkest impulses. Those present felt that they were not merely judging individuals, but confronting the broader phenomenon of moral collapse when power goes unchecked. As the day wore on, observers sensed that the trial had transcended its legal bounds. It had become a collective reckoning, an existential examination of how ordinary people can become agents of cruelty. In that hearing room, the line between victim and spectator blurred, inviting every soul present to reflect on the fragile barrier between duty and depravity. And as the final witness of the day was dismissed, the weight of Barkman's unspoken confession, her deliberate silence, remained the most damning evidence of all. Part 10. Sentencing to death and life imprisonment. After 5 weeks of intense legal confrontation, on June 4th, 1946, the verdict was delivered. 9 of the 11 female defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, while 2 received life imprisonment. Several male co-defendants faced various penalties, but the focus of the proceedings had always been the group of women whose actions had epitomized the camp's cruelty. As the judge read the sentences, the courtroom remained eerily silent. No sobs broke the hush. No applause erupted in relief. Only the collective exhalation of a room weighed down by sorrow and the gravity of justice finally served. If only a criminal verdict could erase the wounds of the past, the spectators might have emptied their tears. Yet this judicial outcome represented merely the beginning of accountability. 2 days before the scheduled executions, the Gdańsk City Council oversaw the erection of 11 numbered gallows in Tarly Square. The wood was still fresh. Hammer marks pockmarked every beam. Though the structures were new, the air around them had been laden with foreboding for days, as if the city itself mourned the coming sacrifice. On the night before the fateful day, each female defendant was summoned for a final opportunity to speak. 3 of the women remained silent, eyes downcast and voices absent. As though words had deserted them in the face of destiny, 2 offered pleas for mercy, their voices trembling but unresolved. 4 requested that their families not be informed of their fate. Fearing to extend their anguish beyond the confines of the square, when asked, Iwa Paredes spoke only one chilling line. "I hope they are filming this." Jenny Wanda Barkman, unwavering, maintained her signature composure, an icy calm that belied the storm of condemnation around her. At dawn on July 4th, the condemned women were loaded onto windowless trucks. The vehicles were deliberately sealed, save for a narrow slit of light beneath each door. A stark reminder that escape from culpability is impossible, no matter how one might flee the surface. As the trucks rumbled through silent streets, the muted glow of morning light illuminated the shadow of their crimes, an undeniable journey toward justice rather than freedom. Meanwhile, in Tarly Square, citizens gathered in the pre-dawn chill, survivors, their faces etched with lines of suffering, stood alongside veterans and families of victims clutching small photographs of lost loved ones. In the growing light, the 11 gallows stood like silent sentinels, each one bearing the weight of unimaginable cruelty. No fanfare marked the event, only the low hum of anticipation as the world held its breath. When the trucks arrived, the condemned were led one by one to their assigned gallows. The crowd watched in somber respect as each woman took her final steps, the numbered platforms crisp against the pale sky. A priest whispered last rites, offering scant comfort. Then, with no drum roll or flourish, the executioner's rope was placed, and the platform beneath each defendant gave way. For a moment, the square fell into profound stillness, an emblem of the final intersection between human justice and the culpability that no uniform or order could absolve. That day, Tarly Square bore witness to more than executions. It stood as a testament to the enduring pursuit of accountability. Though death came swiftly to the 11, the city of Gdańsk and the world beyond saw that even the darkest crimes could not evade the light of justice. Part 11. Erecting the gallows in the square. Tarly Square, destined to host the final executions, was transformed in the 2 days leading up to the event. City workers in Gdańsk erected 11 gallows, each meticulously numbered to correspond with a specific defendant. The timber was fresh, joints still raw, and hammer marks clearly visible on every beam. Deliberately, the municipal council opted for no curtains or stage effects. The executions were to be an unvarnished display of justice, visible to all who chose to bear witness. Inside the adjacent prison, the atmosphere grew equally oppressive. The 11 women were held in solitary isolation, cut off from letters and legal counsel. Jenny Wanda Barkman sat motionless in her cell, writing nothing, her expression as cold and unyielding as the concrete walls around her. Iwa Paredes, restless and tormented, gouged letters into the cell's steel wall with a chipped nail, etching her name in a crude testament to her fear. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Becker knelt at the foot of her bunk, reciting Latin prayers in hushed, urgent tones that reverberated through the bars. A guard recorded in his report, Barkman requested a white dress and refused all meals. Her gaze remained fixed on the wall without blinking. Throughout the complex, The rhythmic pounding of hammers and the rasp of saws filled the air. Mingling with the scent of resin and swirling dust, overhead, the sky was leaden and oppressive, as though the heavens themselves mourned the approaching dawn. Gusts of wind whistled through the rows of empty benches arranged before the gallows, carrying with them a chill promise that on the morrow, thousands would gather as witnesses to justice in its starkest form. Citizens of Gdańsk moved in subdued groups along the square's perimeter. No animated conversations broke the silence. No vendor shouted their wares. Instead, each person seemed wrapped in contemplative stillness, bracing for the historical moment soon to unfold on what had been a bustling market site. Children clutched their parents' coats. Veterans stood with heads bowed, and survivors of the camps stood shoulder to shoulder, their shared trauma binding them in somber solidarity. As twilight deepened, the workers completed their tasks and withdrew, leaving behind the skeletal framework of judgment against the darkening sky. The square, once a place of daily exchange and laughter, now waited empty and expectant. In doorways and alleyways, small clusters of onlookers whispered prayers, gratitude, or simply exhaled long-held breaths. All along the waterfront and through the narrow streets leading to the square, the people carried with them the memory of what had occurred behind barbed wire, of children shivering in the cold, and of cruelty masquerading as duty. On the eve of the largest public tribunal in Gdańsk's history, there was no triumphalism, only a collective readiness to bear witness. The courage of the victims and the resolve of a city demanding accountability coalesced into a quiet vigil, and as the last glimmer of daylight faded, Tarly Square stood poised to etch this chapter of justice into the annals of history. Part 12. The Final Night Before Fate. On the night of July 3rd, 1946, 2 days before their execution, the gallows at Tarly Square underwent a final, chilling preparation. Each of the 11 nooses was tested with sacks of sand weighing 65 kilograms as one bag after another struck the wooden platforms. A series of thuds resonated across the empty square, producing an eerie soundtrack for the impending dawn. After the final test, someone tossed a torn piece of bread onto the boards as if to placate the earth itself. A lone, emaciated dog crept from the shadows and silently consumed the offering. One by one, the condemned women were summoned to a small, dimly lit antechamber for their last opportunity to speak. 3 remained silent to the end, their eyes fixed on the cold stone floor, expressions as immovable as carved granite. 2 others fell to their knees and pleaded for clemency, voices trembling with a hope they knew would go unanswered. 4 more requested that their families not be notified of the outcome, believing that sparing their loved ones the agony of waiting might offer a final act of mercy. When it was Iwa Paredes's turn, she looked up with a detached calm and stated simply, "I hope they are filming this." Her words echoed in the empty cell block, eliciting a faint, involuntary smirk from the guard on duty. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, a priest moved silently from cell to cell, administering absolution to the 2 detainees who wished to confess. Some of the women accepted his ministrations, clutching his hands in desperate gratitude, while others rejected his presence outright. One even splashed water in his face with contempt. The corridor was suffused with hushed whispers of prayer and the distant creak of shackles, as though the walls themselves held their breath in anticipation. By 6:15 a.m., the moments of final reflection had ended. Guards arrived at each cell, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. Without ceremony, the 11 women were led out in single file and ushered onto 2 windowless trucks. Each vehicle offered only a narrow slit of light beneath its heavy doors, underscoring a stark truth. No matter how far one might flee, one's crimes can never be left behind. The engines rumbled, and the trucks lurched forward onto the cobblestone streets, their wheels scraping against stone in a mournful rhythm. Through the pale dawn mist, the caravans made their way toward Tarly Square. Behind the curtained trucks, hearts pounded with the weight of inevitability, the condemned sat in silence or whispered final prayers, their faces illuminated by the slender beams of morning light that slipped under the door flaps. Outside, the growing crowd watched in solemn expectation, the hush of pre-dawn broken only by the distant crowing of a rooster and the faint rustle of flags along the square's perimeter. As the trucks approached, Tarly Square's spectating thousands survivors, relatives of victims, and curious citizens steeled themselves for the last chapter of a long saga of suffering and retribution. The journey through the silent streets served as the final passage for those who had once wielded terror with impunity, now bound for their own reckoning. In that fragile light before sunrise, the boundary between past atrocities and present justice became irrevocably clear, etched into the memory of all who bore witness. Part 13. The Journey to Tarly Square. When the trucks came to a halt, Tarly Square had already filled to capacity, children perched on their parents' shoulders, elders leaning heavily on canes, and reporters murmuring into microphones as they prepared to record each moment. No applause greeted the arrival, no shouts or jeers pierced the hush. Instead, an almost tangible tension hung in the damp air. Above, a uniform blanket of gray clouds pressed down, and icy gusts swept through rows of empty iron benches, carrying with them the sharp scent of pine resin mixed with drifting wood ash. A 19-year-old former inmate stood in the second row, his eyes still sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. He later recalled, "I wanted to cry, but I could not. I felt hollow inside." He spoke those words in the same silence that enveloped the square, where grief and outrage were too profound for tears alone. At 6:45 in the morning, one of the truck doors creaked open. 11 women stepped down in single file, each descending onto the wooden planks with measured dignity. Not one attempted to flee, not one cried out. Instead, each footfall rang out clearly on the fresh timber, as though each step underscored the solemnity of the law being carried out. Jenny Wanda Barkman led the procession, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed straight ahead, never once glancing toward the assembled witnesses. The echo of her heels on the planks seemed to proclaim the finality of her fate. The other 10 followed, maintaining a composed facade or briefly betraying tremors of fear. They were ushered to their pre-assigned platforms, each noose already looped and ready. There were no hoods to conceal their faces, no masks to hide their expressions. Every line and contour of their features was laid bare. Some appeared stoic and unreadable. Others quivered with the weight of impending doom, and a few bore a chilling calm that spoke of resignation. Across the square, clusters of survivors clasped small photographs of family members lost in the camps. A handful of war veterans stood at rigid attention, eyes unwavering. A line of journalists raised cameras, capturing the scene in hushed clicks. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind and the distant roll of thunder, as if nature itself bore witness. As each defendant took her place, the gravity of the moment deepened. One could see the shadow of the gallows fall across the faces of those who would soon stand there in death. For the crowd, it was a final reckoning, a chance to witness the end of a reign of terror that had scarred a nation's soul. Parents gripped their children's hands more tightly, teaching them without words the weight of collective memory and the cost of compassion lost. At the far edge of the square, a ring of soldiers maintained order, their rifles slung but eyes alert. They formed a silent boundary between the living and those about to cross into history. The air was so still that when the first signaling officer raised his arm, every eye followed the motion in unison. Moments later, the signal to proceed would come. Each rope would tighten, each platform would drop, and the square would witness the most profound demonstration of accountability in Gdańsk's history. Yet in this instant, suspended between arrival and action, the city stood united in the somber conviction that justice, though slow, would not be denied. Part 14. The Moment of Execution by Hanging. There was no ceremonial pronouncement, only the soft creak of timber beneath the condemned women's feet. Gaps in the cloud cover allowed shafts of sunlight to pierce the gray sky, illuminating each figure in stark relief. At precisely 6:45 a.m., a court official stepped forward to recite the first name, his voice measured and deliberate, each syllable tolling like a solemn bell. As he spoke, the executioner moved with practiced calm to the adjacent gallows, slipping the noose silently into place around the neck of the first woman. The executioner's hands did not tremble. Jenny Wanda Barkman, at the head of the line, stood motionless, her face blank as a statuesque mask. She closed her eyes briefly, lips parting in what looked like a whispered prayer. The wooden trapdoor beneath her feet swung open without warning. For a fleeting second, Barkman hovered in midair before falling into darkness, and not a single scream escaped her lips. Next came the woman on the third platform, Ewa Paredes. Draped around her shoulders was a scarf of light fabric, its hue reminiscent of ceremonial robes. As her turn approached, she murmured, "I am free," her voice betraying a chilling calm that lingered even as the rope claimed her life. Elizabeth Becker encountered a mechanical fault. The knot of her noose had been tied too loosely. She struggled for several heartbeats, gasping for breath as the crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. When the tension on the rope tightened at last, her body went still, but only after she fought against the instinct to survive. The seventh woman, overcome with terror, lost bodily control, her body involuntarily voiding itself. She gave no cry of shame, only the hush of stunned surprise rippled through the spectators. The ninth defendant, eyes wet with terror, pressed her hands to her face as she awaited the final moments. The 10th softly intoned a verse of sacred hymnody, her voice carrying a mournful melody that hung in the still air before she too was granted her final rest. The youngest prisoner, 21 years old, placed an innocent hand over her heart and spoke a single, poignant phrase, "I only wanted to work." Then she fell silent, her words echoing across the vast square like a lament for all who had suffered at the camp. After each execution, the execution team paused for exactly 2 minutes. This interval ensured that each rope's tension was stable and gave the gathered crowd a moment to absorb the weight of every life lost. No wails of pain disrupted the stillness. No frantic pleas for mercy shattered the solemn quiet. Only the wind whispered through the ancient buildings that ringed Tarly Square, carrying with it the bitter scent of pine and smoldering wood. The bodies remained suspended in grim testimony, not as instruments of humiliation, but as a stark warning: transgress the bounds of justice, and the scales of law will not waver. Villagers, former inmates, and onlookers from distant lands stood witness to a final tableau of accountability as the gallows cast their long mourning shadows. All who watched understood that this was more than punishment. It was a resolute affirmation of the rule of law and a vow that such atrocities would never again find refuge behind silence or authority. Part 15. Reflections and Historical Lessons. The 4th of July, 1946 was entered into the records as the day of the executions. Yet no reporter's headline nor official chronicle could ever capture the haunting image of those bodies swaying in the first light of dawn. This was not a victory over evil. It was an ending without a clear beginning. A somber punctuation mark at the close of a dark chapter in human history. A few months later, an elderly former prisoner, now stooped with age and bearing the scars of his ordeal, spoke publicly for the first time. "I saw them die," he said in a voice heavy with memory. But the most terrible thing was the absence of any remorse. He paused, his rheumy eyes reflecting both pain and contemplation, then added quietly, "They killed us long before they fell." His words struck a chord across the nation. No execution could erase the deeper wounds inflicted by such unfeeling brutality. The Stutthof proceedings closed with that stark reminder: the law can punish the body, but the deepest crimes take root in a soul bereft of conscience. For the victims, justice came too late to restore what was lost. For the perpetrators, death arrived too late to awaken any true regret. Yet, in its own somber way, the trial and its aftermath served as a final lesson for generations to come. The gallows at Tarly Square stood dismantled by autumn, but its memory lingered like a shadow across Gdańsk. School children would be brought to the square years later, instructed to listen to survivors' testimonies so that history would not repeat its darkest moments. Memorial plaques were installed where the wooden platforms once stood, bearing the names of those executed, and an inscription reminding all, never again. In the months that followed, historians and ethicists debated the implications of Stutthof. Some argued that the public nature of the executions had offered a form of closure, a clear demonstration that no crime against humanity would go unpunished. Others questioned the morality of capital punishment itself, asking whether the state's taking of life could truly serve justice or merely perpetuate a cycle of violence. Yet nearly everyone agreed on one point: the real measure of justice was not in the finality of a hanging, but in the ongoing vigilance of society to safeguard dignity and human rights. Survivors, once silent for fear of reprisal, formed support groups and began to share their stories more openly. Their voices, once muffled by fear, became the living testimony of resilience. They campaigned for laws prohibiting torture and for international conventions to protect the innocents in times of war. In doing so, they transformed their personal tragedies into a broader movement for compassion and accountability. Today, the story of Stutthof remains a cautionary tale. It warns that power unchecked can breed unimaginable cruelty, and that cruelty, once institutionalized, corrodes the very fabric of humanity. But it also affirms the enduring value of empathy and the necessity of mercy as counterweights to authority in remembering those final executions on that gray morning. We honor both the victims who suffered injustice and the survivors who, against all odds, reclaimed their voices, and in doing so, helped ensure that the darkest chapters of history would not be forgotten. This video does more than depict a brutal chapter in history. It delivers to viewers horrifying yet essential values and messages. First, it reminds us of the destructive force of unchecked authority and the absence of conscience. The images of female SS guards' cold smiles on their lips as children endured unimaginable suffering reveal that these horrors did not stem solely from orders issued above, but also from personal gratification in inflicting pain on others. Second, the video underscores the importance of recording and preserving historical memory. Through former prisoners' testimonies, diaries, and medical records, we see that evidence cannot be erased by the passage of time. Staging a public trial and summoning hundreds of witnesses served not only to punish the perpetrators, but also to ensure that the world would bear witness, preventing the victim's agony from ever fading into oblivion. Third, the video conveys the indomitable spirit and thirst for justice of the Polish people. Having endured more than 5 years under brutal occupation, they stood firm in demanding that those who abused power face fitting consequences. Thousands of Gdańsk residents gathered in Tarly Square that fateful morning, silent yet unwavering, awaiting the moment when justice would be delivered. Their presence bore testament to the strength of solidarity and the resolve never to let suffering be hastily forgotten. Finally, we learn that justice may be slow but is never absent. No matter how ruthless the crimes or how cunning the perpetrator's attempts to escape, thorough documentation, prosecution, and public trial form the bridge that ensures every act of brutality is held to account. Beyond a history lesson, this video serves as a warning to us all. Never underestimate the voice of conscience, and never allow "I was only following orders" to become a shield for injustice. The most important takeaway is a steadfast belief in the value of human dignity and the responsibility to safeguard justice for generations to come.